Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the latest of Eno's webinar series. As you know, Eno is an independent, nonpartisan transportation think tank based here in Washington, D.C. We are still celebrating our 100th year. If you haven't had a chance, check it out at 100years.enotrans.org. My name is Paul Lewis, and I am the policy director here at Eno, and I'm moderating today's webinar. And today we are discussing transportation and cybersecurity. These are the next steps to secure our cyber future. Cyber attacks on our transportation system can have a real debilitating effect on the economy and on public safety. And I think we're all very familiar with the Colonial Pipeline cyber attack that happened just last year. I think some of those effects are still being felt in the policy sphere and in the transportation system. But systems like oil pipelines are not the only ones that are vulnerable to attacks. Transit networks, airlines, supply chains, any system that is connected could be vulnerable, which basically includes every bit of transportation. And many of these systems are underprepared for the future potential attacks. And although cybersecurity doesn't capture the public mind and attention until a crisis strikes, we have to be putting in policies now to stay ahead of the issue. And I think that most people agree with that. The question that a lot of us have are, what are those policies and how can we be proactive? And so in this webinar, we're going to discuss that, the nature of the cybersecurity threats that the industry faces, and what are some smart public policies that need to be in place to make sure that we stave it off as best as we can. Luckily for us, we have three very distinguished speakers to help us sort through all this. And I'm going to introduce them all here very briefly. Their full bios are available on our website and on this webinar's web page. First is Scott Belcher. Scott is the Chief Executive of SFB Consulting. He works at the intersection of transportation, technology, and communications on a host of public and private sector issues, such as cybersecurity and many others. He also has published several articles via the Mineta Transportation Institute that many of you have read. And before founding SFB Consulting, Scott was the CEO of the Telecommunications Industry Association, as well as the CEO of ITS America, and has held executive leadership positions in a number of other prominent trade associations around the industry. Second up is Michael Daniel. He is the president and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance, or CTA. He leads the CTA team, oversees the organization's operations, and prior to joining that, the CTA, Michael was part of the Obama administration as a special assistant coordinating cybersecurity on the National Security Council staff. In this role, Michael led the development of a national cybersecurity strategy and policy and ensured that the U.S. government effectively partnered with the private sector, non-governmental organizations in other countries. And last but certainly not least, we have Ari Schwartz, who is the managing director of cybersecurity services at Venable. In that capacity, he directs cybersecurity services for Venable's cybersecurity risk management group and guides the establishment of cybersecurity consulting services and coordinates the Cybersecurity Coalition, a group of leading cybersecurity companies dedicated to educating policymakers on cybersecurity issues and promoting a vibrant marketplace for cybersecurity technology solutions. So thank you all to each of you panelists for joining us today. Really appreciate you taking the time and volunteering your expertise. Just a couple quick housekeeping items for everybody. The format for today's webinar is a conversation, so I'll be asking the panelists some of my own questions. And we'll make sure that there's time for you all to ask your questions later in the webinar. So you can enter them in the box on the side of your screen at any time. And I'm going to try to make sure we get to as many of those as possible in the latter half of the webinar today. We don't expect any tech issues on this webinar, but we found that if for some reason you personally are experiencing an issue, the best way is to exit and then rejoin the webinar. That tends to resolve a lot of issues. So hopefully that doesn't happen, but please try that first if you are having any technical issues. And then last but not least, Eno is happy to offer this webinar free of charge. If you enjoy this and you're interested in supporting Eno's work, you can check out the link in the chat box to donate or become a member. And then finally, a recording of this webinar will be emailed to all of the registrants following this webinar. So let's get started. We're going to start by an opening question about about cybersecurity itself. And I think we hear a lot about cyber, but we don't quite know the extent to which the threat exists. And I think given your background and roles, I think it'd be helpful if you could give an overview of the risks that cybersecurity attacks pose to the transportation system specifically. And we're going to start with you, Michael, and then we'll go to Scott and then Ari. So Michael, if you want to kick us off with your reactions and thoughts.
Yeah, sure. And thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me here today. I'm happy to be participating in this conversation. I really sort of classify sort of the cybersecurity threats that an organization that's a transportation, part of the transportation system, you really have three potential threats that you face. One is that somebody could be trying to steal information out of your organization for one of two purposes. One purpose would be for money. Like, can they take that data and monetize it in some way? Customer data, credit card data, personally identifiable information, anything you can take and actually, turn into money. Intellectual property. If you're a organization that actually develops, new products and services, they could be, sold for, those purposes. You could also be stealing information to gain a business advantage, right? If you're entering into a deal or some sort of new contract, that can be valuable. So any information that can be stolen and monetized, that's sort of one class of cybersecurity threat. The next class of threats is really about ransomware and using ransomware to disrupt your operations, and whether that is because they are disrupting your business systems that enable you to carry on, business and billing and communications, or whether they're interrupting your operational technology. But somehow or another, they're using ransomware to prevent your business from operating. And there, the model is, unless you pay us an extortion fee, we're not going to let you, resume your business operations. So that's kind of the second class of threat. And then the third class of threat really comes from a different source. Those first two threats are really about criminals, organizations that are out to make money. Now, some of those are nation state backed, but they're criminals and they're about the money. The third class actually are the nation states themselves. And depending on what kind of transportation system company you are, a foreign nation might actually have an interest in targeting you for the ability to cause a disruptive or destructive effect to achieve a foreign policy goal. And that could be, for example, if you are if you're a rail company inside Ukraine, you might well be being targeted by the Russians so that the Ukrainians can't use you to, move troops around, right? And even here in the United States, if something goes south between Russia and Ukraine and there's actual physical attack, you could see the Russians trying to cause disruption here in the United States for their purposes. So those are really the three classes of cyber threats that I think of when I think about the transportation system.
That's a really helpful classification, and I'd like to turn it over to Scott to build on that. So taking those kind of broad classifications, what does it mean to the private and public entities that you've been working with in terms of the threats?
Sure. Hi. Well, thank you for having me here. I appreciate it. And I'm really here largely on behalf of the Mineta Transportation Institute, who sponsored the various research that we've done. I really liked Michael's characterization. I guess let me take it maybe. I'm going to go in a matter of three, but just slightly different. First of all, so Michael talked about a couple of categories. I can just give you specific examples, at least within two of those categories. One is the Bay Area BART, Bay Area Regional Transit Authority, experienced a situation in which 1,000 of its switches were found to be counterfeit, had been taken out of service, refurbished, and a foreign agent had placed chips into them. And that was discovered before they went into operation, but it resulted in an international criminal investigation that I suspect Michael's very familiar with, and implicated a number of transit agencies as well as a number of major vendors. And kudos to BART for being willing to talk about it, because the one thing about cyber is cyber's like Fight Club. The first rule is you don't talk about it. And until we talk about it and bring some sunlight to the issue, the harder it's going to be to fight. A second example, recent example that's in the news has been the Rhode Island Transit Authority, which was suffered from a ransomware attack, and they 20,000 state employees' personal information was put at risk, and so I'm sure Michael can talk about the process of when you're the victim of one of these attacks, but it's pretty complicated. It's like a hostage negotiation. These guys are very serious criminals. They know what they're doing. The risk. So now let me just take it to another level. When we look at transit, we surveyed a third of the transit agencies in North America. Pretty huge sample. And we found that while the transit agencies thought that they were prepared for cybersecurity, in fact, 81% of them believed they were prepared. Only 60% of them had a cyber preparedness plan. 43% of them didn't think they had the resources to manage an attack, and less than 50% audited. Those are all key elements to having a mature cyber program in place. So it's very inconsistent. And then the last thing I would say that I find interesting as kind of introductory, when we started our work in transit, we were concerned. We thought we should be concerned about a hostile actor taking control of a vehicle or of a train. You remember the movie Speed. And that's what people think about. But when we actually drilled down and talked to CEOs, that wasn't really what they were worried about. Now, I mean, I think it's real, it's possible. It's not out of the realm of possibility. But really what folks are interested in, what CEOs worry about, what keeps CEOs at night is their ability to control their operations, is their ability to control their business operations, and their ability to manage PCI and fair payment systems. And so those are really the vulnerability points for operational transportation agencies right now, at least based on our research.
That's really helpful. And do check out some of the research links that we have in the webinar page to read more about some of those. And I'm sure Scott will expand on that during this discussion. But let me turn it over to Ari. Again, I want to hear some of your reactions, given your perspectives in terms of the threats, perhaps some things that need to be added onto the list.
Yeah, so I'll follow up where Scott ended, which is, I mean, I think that a lot of the focus has been on the modes of transportation, particularly because, as we all know, modern modes of transportation are moving computers, right? That are networked, right? And we often see most of the cybersecurity folks, especially from leadership of a lot of organizations, is on desktop computing still, even with it. Maybe they go to laptop and cell phone, but they don't really necessarily think of all the different pieces as being truly networked. And transportation has moved more into that better understanding to some degree. Although, as Scott points out, right? I mean, the fact that you have the BART situation there, you had component parts of the rail cars that were that are a risk, right? And that alone demonstrates the set of issues here. I also think that one thing that we see in transportation that is different from other sectors that I've seen in transportation that's different from other sectors is this general idea of safety versus security. It's not really a debate that you have in other sectors, right? I think most other sectors see that it's basically the same thing when it comes to cybersecurity. And I think in transportation, it should be obvious it's the same thing, but it's the regulatory structures that separate out safety versus security in other areas. And then people come into cybersecurity and they say it has the word security in it. So therefore, if it's not really a safety issue, it's a security issue. The security people deal with it, but it should be thought of as both, right? I mean, I think we have to, even though from a regulatory standpoint, the regulators might try and separate out the two. I think companies and organizations have to look at it as security. Anytime you hear cybersecurity, you have to think of safety issues as well when it comes to transportation. And then, and linked to that, and linked to kind of linking these two things together, I wanted to kind of take a look at if you look at the Colonial Pipeline case, and this goes directly to what Scott was saying, you have a situation there where their business systems were hacked, right? But they had to shut down their operations because they could not be certain about what was happening with their operations and what could happen and what that could mean for the pipeline and the future of the systems. So they had to shut everything down. And I think that transportation systems need to think about that as like kind of the worst possible consequence of a business system getting hacked. So it's not just that you just can't pay your people, it's also that your operations might be affected and there could be safety issues as well. So I think that's kind of the bigger picture piece here.
All right, so those are some really great points, and a little disconcerting, right, to know some of the threats that are out there. And I want to kind of pitch it back to you, Ari, since you've been talking about, the next question that I have teed up is what are organizations doing to address some of these threats? But I'm curious by one of the points you made about how a lot of transportation organizations view safety and security as separate. And so before we get into it, can you kind of elaborate that and say why is that the case, and what are they doing to change that paradigm?
Yeah, from what I know, I mean, because historically they have been separated, right? And then you come in with something like cybersecurity and
we can't hear you.
Now can you hear me? There you go.
Yes.
Traditionally they've been separated, and safety. The folks that work on safety see the word security, they think they're not supposed to work on it, right? And so I think that it takes organizations. The organizations have to take a purposeful step to say this is different. Even though it has the word security in it, it does affect safety. We do have to work on it. We do have to do some look at the risks posed across the safety risks that come from some of the security piece, and bring in the safety people as we're doing the assessments and the planning around security. Which I've been in situations working with some transportation organizations where that was not obvious to people. So and to me, I think it was super obvious, right? Coming in, and so we asked that question. So that is something that I like to raise in when we talk about transportation, because I think it is different than other sectors where those two things are separated out often. And again, I think it becomes because of the way they were regulated historically. Look at TSA, and in the airline space is a very obvious one. TSA and doing security, and FAA doing safety, right? Two are separated. They shouldn't meet. Different people deal with each of them inside the organizations. So that's an example, but that's not the only one. I mean, I've seen it in several of the different sectors and inside subsectors in transportation. From there, I do want to touch on, though, kind of the question on like what are people doing, because I do think that I think Scott laid it out pretty well in terms of the focus on doing risk assessments in this space. I want to go just kind of drill down one more level from that, it's particularly he was talking about plans in the space. I do think that there are a lot that don't have plans, but we also have seen a lot that do have plans. I think then from the planning comes policies, right, as well as and how you go about doing it, doing a kind of general risk assessment once you have all of that laid out and seeing where your gaps are, something that a lot of people do. Now, we suggest basing that on the NIST cybersecurity framework, and this is something I'm going to get to in a little more detail, where maritime, for example, has a profile under the NIST cybersecurity framework that and most sectors now, financial, medical, all the energy subsectors, all have these profiles that were built under the NIST cybersecurity framework. Maritime has done this. The other sectors have not, subsectors have not done this. CISA has written something under DHS. CISA has written something for the transportation sector as a whole regarding the framework, but when it gets down to the lower sectors, using the cybersecurity, building a cybersecurity profile makes sense for the subsectors and then you can build assessments off of that. So that's one area that we have seen that there were some have done it, but a lot have not. And then at the end piece here is exercising, right? And when I say exercising, I don't just mean the security folks get together and run a technical exercise. I mean that leadership gets involved in the exercise at least once a year and kind of looks through and you do different. Michael laid out 3 different types of major risks, doing each one of those every 3 years and cycling through them with leadership. Security has to do more exercising than that, but you need to be able to bring in leadership and bring in the different parts of the organization that could be involved in an incident when it happens, because there's, we have seen situations where we've gone in and exercises and the security people, you get to the point of like, do you shut down the system? And the security people say, yes, we would shut down the system, and the CEO is like, no, we do not shut down the system. Right? And it's not your decision, and security people are left out of the room. I mean, and if they're the ones making that determination at that point, right, then they are then you have and they're the only one exercising. They don't have a realistic example of what's actually going on and going to happen. So, and that changes the way you write your policies and your planning based on those exercises as well. So, and as Scott said, I think the auditing piece comes in after that, after you've built your plans, you've exercised them and gone back and made updates.
Got it. That's helpful. And Scott, you were nodding your head a lot. Any reactions and thoughts to add to that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll probably all end up saying the same things in different ways, because I saw Michael nodding his head too. I think Ari is spot on a lot of things. I mean, first of all, just to kind of pile on, transportation is different, and understanding the difference between security and risk is critical, because there is a difference. Security, when you're addressing security, your goal is to be free from harm, and when you're managing risk, it's part of being anticipating, analyzing, and managing, and then addressing it. And so really to do that, cybersecurity has got to become part of an enterprise risk management portfolio of an operation. It's got to be on the same level as security. It's got to be part of an executive that's in the C-suite and that's part of the executive team, and that's reporting regularly to the CEO and to the board of directors. This isn't something, I mean, I guess this isn't something that can be outsourced to the IT department, which is where a lot of it is right now. It's an IT person, and cybersecurity means pen testing. Well, that's not reality. And what Ari talked about, Ari mentioned a number of really good practices, but it is key to change the organizational culture so that cybersecurity is throughout the organization. And it's got to start at the receptionist and it's got to go to the CEO and the board. There's got to be regular training, and then there's got to be, as Ari suggested, you've got to then practice and test. So there's got to be tabletop exercises. There could be risk management. There's a whole series of things. I think the other thing that that kind of comes with that I find really interesting is there's a ton of soft stuff that agencies can do that can get them a long way towards cyber maturity or cyber maturity. And it is training, it is having job descriptions, it is having report to the CEO, it is risk management, all of those things. Those are policy. A lot of that is policies and procedures and doesn't require a lot of expensive hardware. And to that point, a lot of every agency has cybersecurity protection. They may not know it, but if you're using Microsoft Outlook, you've got cybersecurity protection. If you're using Google, you can turn on two-factor authentication through your Google feed. I mean, there's a lot of things that agencies can do once they know about it. I think the other thing that I would pivot off of Ari, and then I'll stop, is, Ari did mention that transportation is different. It is different because of the safety needs. And that's really driven a unique problem for transportation versus other industries. And this is a place where I sometimes find myself differing from the cybersecurity experts. So cybersecurity experts, cybersecurity is cybersecurity is cybersecurity. There's a set standards, set protocols that you go about in trying to protect an agency. And it's very mature. It's a very mature science, and it's being led by the Department of Defense, being led by the financial services industry. The problem is that every sector thinks they're different, and to some extent they are. And so how is transportation different? Transportation is different because it's grossly underfunded. It has zero tolerance for failure, and as a result, it builds hardware that's meant to last for 10 or 15 years with firmware and software that it doesn't maintain and can't be upgraded. And as a result, there's a disconnect between there's a disconnect between technology and hardware. The software can't keep up, or the hardware can't keep up with the software, and there's this incredible tension between operators and vendors, because you think you've sold the operator thinks that they've bought a 15-year-old piece of equipment that's going to last for 15 or 20 years, and that's what you told them, and it will. The hardware will last for 15 to 20 years, and it'll work, and you'll get 99.999% safety. But what it won't do, because you've built it that way, is it won't keep up with technology. And that's a real conundrum for both operators as well as vendors. So I'll stop with that. I'm sure Michael's got some really interesting thoughts on, you can kind of take that and run with it.
Yeah, definitely want to make sure we pivot over here to Michael, and then we're going to dive into some questions that are coming in about federal policy. But yeah, Michael, your reactions would be great.
Yeah, sure. I mean, two broad thoughts on that. One is that one of our big problems in cybersecurity is that for too long we've actually treated it as if it were purely a technical problem. And if you just bought the latest snort flabulator and stuck it on your network, that you could just solve all of your problems, and that's just not true. The technology is a piece of it, but it's as much about the organizational policies, your structures, your incident reporting planning. It's all of those other things that actually go into it. And so cybersecurity is also a business problem, because it's about how you prioritize relative to your other business issues. It's an economic issue. It's all these other kinds of things all sort of rolled together. And so when you treat it purely as a technical problem, you end up failing at it, essentially. And you need to bring in other kinds of solutions and approaches in addition to the technology. And sometimes the best solution for a particular company might, in fact, not be a technological one. It may be a policy issue, or workforce training or something like that. The second piece is that I think of this problem really as a security, privacy, safety triad. And that if you overweight any of those vertices, you end up with policies that are out of whack. And that in a digital world, in a world where, as Ari said, your transportation system is essentially a network of computers that happen to move, or that either move themselves or move things, right? That if you don't think about safety, if you don't think about privacy in addition to the security, it'll all fail, right? And the policies have to be mutually reinforcing. And then the last thing I'll just point out, though, is that one thing that's really cool about the transportation sector is this sector has thought a lot about safety and how to actually make safety work with, frankly, dumb humans, right? Humans that do stupid things and still manage to make the safety work, right? And there's a lot of things that I often use as examples from the safety world saying we need to do more of that in security. Like, your car doesn't ask you, should I engage anti-lock brakes? Yes, no. Like, the car just does it, right? It doesn't ask you that. It doesn't depend on the user, engaging with the anti-lock brake system. It just works. And we've got to bring a lot more of that sort of ethos into the rest of the security world to make security much, much simpler. And so there's a lot of lessons that can actually be learned for the transportation sector and applied in other areas.
That's great, and I appreciate that kind of bringing that ethos culture. I mean, you've got all have kind of talked about process and culture and ethos into the system, and so I want to pivot a little bit, and I'm going to go back to you, Michael, on this question about federal policy. We're here in Washington, and we at ENO have noticed, and some of our questioners have also picked up on this, an increasing emphasis on cybersecurity at the federal level. DOT funding programs like NHPP, or the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, now allow assistance for dealing with cybersecurity threats as part of eligibility. The bipartisan infrastructure law emphasizes the importance of cybersecurity considerations being built into the infrastructure from the very start. The DOT strategic framework also mentions cybersecurity several times. And so my question to you, Michael, and then we'll go back to Ari and Scott. What does cybersecurity emphasis in the federal policy tell us about security challenges that are present today, and whether we're doing enough to address them?
Yeah, so I mean, the way that I really think about this is that the environment has fundamentally changed, and when I think back to the world that I lived in when I joined the federal government in the mid-1990s, and I know Ari is a contemporary of this, right? If the network went down, we just did something else for the day. We worked on our non-networked computers. We called people on the phone. We actually met with them face to face, right? The business of the organization didn't stop just because the IT network had been interrupted in some way. But now we're fundamentally in a world where those things that used to be minorly annoying are now potentially, existential, right? You could actually have an incident that starts in cyberspace that ends up with a physical result in the real world that could end up actually killing somebody, or many people, right? And that puts a different cast on it. And when you move, and as I used to say, it's one thing if you get the blue screen of death on your Windows system, or your Excel spreadsheet crashes, right? It's another if your rail system goes down, or your Chevy gets driven off the road, or you have a pipeline spill, right? All of those things have varying different levels of effect. And so the result is, it should not be surprising that now that we've moved into that realm where you can cause physical damage and harm, that the federal government is going to take its role much more seriously in pushing the private sector to say, okay, you've got to start demonstrating to us that you are actually implementing and taking this risk seriously, and that you're managing it seriously, and that you're managing it appropriately. And there's now going to be a lot of argument around what does managing it appropriately mean, and that's where the real policy debate is happening. That's where RA's organization, my organization, Scott's organization spend time talking about, like, what does that actually mean? What is appropriate? But it shouldn't really, but it should not surprise anyone now at this point that that's where the federal government is moving, and it's only going to move more in that direction, in my view. And so really the question is sort of how do we engage and ensure that the federal government is providing the resources that are necessary to support improvements, but also regulating in a smart way so that it actually is going to achieve the results that it wants to achieve.
Well said. Ari, I want to get your reactions to the recent federal emphasis. Is it enough? Is it the right direction?
Well, I'd say I agree with what Michael said. I mean, for years and years, we underinvested in cybersecurity, and now you're starting to see some investment. I mean, some actual real investment. I like to point out, 15 years ago, the FBI director said that cybersecurity was going to outpace terrorism as the biggest threat to the United States. But it's not until this budget and this infrastructure bill that you're starting to see more money go to cybersecurity than terrorism, than fighting terrorism. That I think demonstrates, we've been behind, and we've seen the consequences of that. And but with more federal money, as Michael was implying, I think, comes more regulation and more oversight. And I think that is what is going to follow along with that money. So I think I hope that we stay more focused on it. But then the question is, how do you go about overseeing the use of that money in the right way? And then if you're going to regulate, that we do it in a smart way and not a way that just makes people jump through hoops and pushes all of the security talent to compliance versus doing stronger security. And I'm not putting down compliance. I think compliance is important. But one thing, so in the financial sector where they've already had this shift, right? They created this group, the Cyber Risk Institute, and the goal of the Cyber Risk Institute is to take the language of how they want to be regulated and try and spread it around the world, and basically say, here are the steps that mature financial services use to protect themselves and the language that they use to do it. Please regulate us in this way, right? Versus just waiting for the regulators to hand them something and saying no to it all the time, right? Instead, they're proactively saying, we have a way that works, please use it, right? This is the way that's going to be best for all of us, rather than having, because they were already getting audited like 24 times in a year by different regulators. Because it would be different jurisdictions, each wanted to come in with their own language and their own way of doing it. So, can we get that down to, it's not to one, but many fewer, but we all agree that we've done the right audits and we're doing the right things and we're following the right way. That's really what this language that the Cyber Risk Institute is doing in that regard. And I think it would make sense for the transportation sub sectors to think that way as well. Because you're going to get requests around the world on this, and how do we go about coming up with what we want to see as opposed to what's going to be put upon us.
Scott, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Ari and Michael. I mean, it's obvious there's a greater attention in this administration than there has been in a very long time, which is wonderful. There will be greater regulation. Only 2 of 16 of the transportation sectors have gotten any regulation. And so that you can expect 14 more directives at least. Those directives are very reasonable. I mean, and they're very they're table stakes. The sad reality is that a lot of operating agencies don't have those table stakes at this point. And so I mean, so if you look at let me just go back to the transit agency, So the recent rail directive only applies to, I don't know, APTA estimates it applies to between 23 and 30 transit agencies. There's over 3,000 transit agencies in the United States. There's an accompanying information circular that highly recommends that the other agencies do that. And but right now there's not a requirement. The other agencies are certainly paying attention, but until it becomes a reality, until you've been burned, it's hard to get their attention. When the Mineta Transportation Institute did its study, the vast majority of the agencies that we spoke with wanted rules. They wanted regulation. And I know this is controversial. I testified about this, and I'm not speaking on behalf of the industry. I'm not speaking on behalf of any industry. I'm just talking to you about the results of our study. The results of our study were particularly small to mid-sized agencies. They just want to know what to do. I mean, the sophisticated ones, they have resources and they have a good sense of what to do. They are following best practices. The small agencies do want, and I guess the final thing is you're going to see more. I mean, I said that, but you are going to see more. I mean, the National Defense Authorization Act has requirements and money. That the infrastructure bill has money. And interestingly, and I think just as importantly, is the Department of Defense has a requirement called the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Program, where vendors to the DoD have to meet certain standards. Whatever the DoD does in the procurement arena makes its way throughout the rest of government, and that's going to come. And so, that's going to come regardless of whether Congress does anything. That's going to happen. That's just the way it flows down through the food chain here in Washington. And so, for any agency, whether it's whatever transportation agency it is, whatever government agency it is, they can expect to start to see those kinds of requirements.
Thank you for that. I want to get to a couple of questions from the audience. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to summarize a few of them. I'm going to ask them to one of you specifically. And if others want to chime in, that's great. If not, we can move on to the next one. And so this one is actually, this first one's for Scott. Picking up on two things that you said earlier on in your kind of opening remarks about how cybersecurity is like Fight Club. We don't talk about it. Do we need to have some kind of federal or state level reporting requirements like we do in the safety community, where we report a lot of safety incidents in transit or railroad or different transportation elements? What's the role of reporting and transparency in this?
So what are the requirements in the three TSA directives that have come out on pipelines and on rail is to require reporting. I mean, I think Michael, I don't know if it was Michael or Ari, talked about the complexity of implementing the requirements. So the complexity there is, what do you report, who do you report it to, and what qualifies as an incident? Those are things we can work out and we will work out, but yeah, 100%. We need that information. That information, there are ways to categorize it, there are ways to anonymize it, but until you have that information and you can analyze it and use analytic tools to start to tell you, you can really see really important trends. I mean, one of the breaches that I've helped out on, it turns out there is a cyber criminal firm that is that's essentially franchising their process. And I know Michael and Ari know who I'm talking about, but and so from their perspective, if you get a professional like Michael or Ari to help you in that situation, you kind of know what the game is, who to bring in as a negotiator, how the negotiation is going to play out, and you hope to be able to buy your client time so that they can go through that process and figure out how at risk they are. And I think the interesting thing here, and I've gone on too long, is that So we initially start out with the premise that we're not going to negotiate with terrorists. And it becomes a business, it very quickly becomes a business analysis. You can't stand on principle here. I agree, nobody wants to negotiate with terrorists, but at the end of the day, sometimes you have to, and people are finding themselves in those situations, even though they don't want to be there.
Great, thank you for that, Scott. This next question I want to direct to Ari, there's actually two of them from the chat here. Related to a couple years ago, I recall there was an instance where a Jeep was hacked through their infotainment center, and it took over the controls of the vehicle, and they drove the vehicle into a ditch. And one of the outcomes was physically separating the infotainment system from a lot of the controls. What does that approach, how does that play into this, right? Separating some of the business information networks from some of the operational networks. Is that something that is a necessary strategy, or is that something that
Yes,
not quite as important?
First of all, I'll say I bought 2 Jeeps since that report came out, so I am a believer that things have been taken care of, even though some people in the security community think I'm totally crazy for that, but that's my view. So just to give Jeep a little bit of a break there. I think the principle is actually, or the control set is in cybersecurity, to get a little bit technical here, is called segmentation, right? And the issue is that the more you have together and the flatter you have as your network, in other words, then people can make their way across that network if they can figure out ways to become to get a lot of permissions, right? So you think that the administrators have the most permissions, right? Like people want to hack the CEO to get their information, et cetera. But getting an administrative account, or figuring out like one of the passwords that like automatically makes you an administrator, in some cases of networks that have not been taken care of, are really golden, because you can work your way across different networks. So the more segmented that you can get them, and put controls in them so that only certain people can get there, and totally air gapping them, as we call it, air gapping meaning one thing's over here and then another thing's over here, and there's a gap between them that can't be connected. Doesn't solve every issue involved, because there's often ways to reconnect them, but it does minimize the issues. And so this has to do with segmentation and authorization issues, and what people are allowed to do and how they can do it across the different pieces. And so it comes back, I was talking about the NIST cybersecurity framework, and the key to the NIST cybersecurity framework is that it's the Rosetta Stone for cybersecurity. That when we have a problem, that someone finds a security problem, they build a control to fix it, right? And in different sectors, those controls have been built pretty much the same, but they might be called different things, or they're mentioned in different ways. The goal of the cybersecurity framework was to take all of those and boil it down to a certain number of controls. It was like somewhere around 250 controls, and then bring that up to kind of like a series of families of those controls, right? So then you have 5 main areas that we focus on, right? So, and above those, that's the same for every sector. But then the question is, what's the most important for your sector? And that's where the profile comes in and brings it back down from the NIST cybersecurity framework and says, here are the control sets we use. But in every one of these, segmentation is going to be a control set. The question is, how important is it? For transportation, we found, particularly for the vehicles, it is extremely important, but it's also important in other areas as well. It's the same issue in authorization too. It's the same issue that I was talking about before on Colonial Pipeline, where they worried about the business unit and that in the target breach as well. They worked their way across from the air conditioning controls, right? That's how they got in, through the air conditioning, and worked their way across to the payment units and stole money from the payments by getting into the air conditioning. That should never be the case, right? You should be able to segment out enough and get enough controls in place, but too often that is the case. And as Michael was saying, with the when you start talking about nation states, they're very good and very patient, and they will work and work and work until they can do that. So the more segmentation you have, the better. But it's you can't always stop everything, but you should be able to try. You should be trying to do that.
Yeah, and Paul, the other thing that I would just add on top of that is it also points to the importance of designing cybersecurity in from the very beginning, right? That just like with a safety feature, right, it's very difficult to sort of bolt it on afterwards. You know, you've got to embed that very deeply into the design process and at a very fundamental level. And a lot of what we're talking about is how do you do your design from the very beginning to bake in those cybersecurity practices. And when you do that, then you are much more resilient and you make yourself a much harder target for the adversaries.
Got it. And actually,
I should also say that there's a lot of
Please.
cases where large control systems, which is important in this industry as well, you know, and it's particularly certain areas that where they're designed not to connect to the internet, right? But people find ways around that so that they can get access and do shortcuts to fix things or to make improvements, etc. So a lot of people don't think stuff's connected to the internet, but it actually is, right? So there is this, you know, ways to test whether your control systems are connected to the internet, and it's extremely important for companies that have large control systems to make sure that they are regularly testing whether they are, and if they are, why, and how do you go about securing that? Because it's really much more difficult to secure something that's connected to the internet that way. Just to get to that a little bit broader point here.
So one connected system that's come up, I think 7 or 8 times in the questions is the supply chain, right? Which is this kind of amorphous thing that is how we are getting all of our goods delivered to our house and to the stores and things that we need for society to function. What role does and how does cybersecurity fit into that kind of massive piece? I'm going to direct this to you, Michael, just to get your thoughts on that. And then anyone else can jump in before a couple final questions here.
Well, so you know what's interesting is that there's actually 2 different meanings to supply chain in the cybersecurity world, because there's actually what you just mentioned, Paul, is like the physical supply chain. Like how do you actually move goods and services from, you know, point of manufacture to, or, you know, the raw inputs through the manufacturing process, through the assembly process, and, you know, to some sort of endpoint to the end user. But in the security field, we also talk about the software supply chain, like the supply chain of where you're actually getting the components that you're using to build software that runs these things, and runs anything, whether you're talking about OT systems, IT systems, that kind of thing. And both of those are potential threat vectors. And what you, just like you have a bill of materials in the physical world, in the virtual world, we're starting to develop what we call a software bill of materials, so that you actually start to look at and understand where did all the different pieces of this software come from? Where were they assembled? Who had a hand in it, right? And so just like you want to know that, just like you have to map that out if you're a logistics company and you have to map out the supply chain, the physical supply chain, you also want to be doing that in the virtual world as well. And to some degree, this is where I actually think that the prevention actually begins to break down, and you have to begin to rely somewhat on resilience and response. And that's why, you know, Ari mentioned what the pieces of that NIST cybersecurity framework, you know, identify, know what you have, protect what you got, detect, so you know if something bad is happening. But the last 2 parts are respond and recover, because cyber incidents are inevitable. And so part of it is that you want to be able to respond quickly and minimize the impact that a cyber incident has and recover quickly from it. And I think particularly with the supply chain, while there are things that you can do to sort of reduce the risk there, because the supply chains are so complex and because they are inherently sort of chaotic and complex in the mathematical senses of those terms, knowing a priori where all your risks are is essentially impossible. So to some degree, you've got to be able to manage and contain that risk once it emerges very quickly. And so I think that the supply chain is one place where I think I put a lot of emphasis on the respond and recover piece.
Let me do a slightly different tact on that. So the supply chain can be defined in different ways. I think in one way, particularly in the transportation arena, much of the work is done by vendors that you can define as a supply chain if you want. And the vendors have so Mineta Transportation Institute will be releasing a study next month on what the vendor community can do to support the transit industry. And through that assessment, what they found is that many of the vendors are more sophisticated than the transit agencies themselves because they're bigger companies, they're operating in other sectors, and so they're bringing best practices to bear. And so if a vendor has good cyber hygiene itself, that cyber hygiene transfers to its customers. The alternative is also true as well. But to really take advantage of that benefit that comes with outsourcing your support, you've got to be able to ask for it properly, and that's a huge issue that we're facing right now. If you don't have the sophistication to ask in a procurement document what you need, what you end up doing is you end up overburdening, end up asking for more than you need. You don't use it as a differentiator, and you drive up costs. And we're seeing all of those things right now. And so if we can get that right, and organizations like APTA, like AASHTO, like Mineta, like the organizations like Ari and Michael do, if we can put together some standard procurement language that will work in various situations, we can go a long way to really helping with the supply chain.
Thank you for your thoughts on that. Yeah, I'm looking at the questions. We've got, a couple dozen that I'd love to get to, but I just want to be respectful of everyone's time. We've got 3 minutes before the top of the hour. And so I'd just like a quick 1 minute closing thought from each one of you. Kind of, what are the next steps in cybersecurity? What are the very briefly, a couple things we need to be doing as an industry to making sure that we're on the right track? We'll do Scott and then Ari, and then we'll close with you, Michael.
I'm not going to. What I'm going to do is TSA has what they call its 5 and 5. And it's 5 simple things that an agency can do or an organization can do to protect itself. The first one is to develop familiarity with the NIST framework, Ari. The second is to implement unique password change policy. The third is to understand phishing and spam trends and how to message awareness to your staff. The fourth is to differentiate access control among the staff. Not everybody needs to have access to the same things. You need to be careful about that. And then the fifth is to report cybersecurity incidents. If an organization does that, those are simple things to do. You can get yourself a long way along the path.
That's great. Appreciate that from the organizational level. Ari, your closing thoughts.
Yeah, I think in general, from the organizational level, I think that it is the leadership being able to ask the right questions and not being afraid of what the answers are going to be. I think we're still, unfortunately, at the level, and particularly in a lot of transportation companies and organizations, of being afraid to find out what problems you might have and where you are on them. So from the organizational level, and I've said it, that I'll repeat what I said at the sectoral level or the subsector level of looking at how we go about build security profiles that work for the sector, so that the sector is the one that is saying how it should look at security versus getting regulated into figuring that out.
Excellent. Michael?
So I will close by saying that while it can seem overwhelming or way too technical or simply overwhelming because it just seems there's too many threats and there's not much you can do about it. The truth is you can improve your cybersecurity and you can materially reduce your risk. You can never drive your risk to zero. And so any vendor that shows up and says, I can solve your cybersecurity problem and you won't have any more risk, throw them out. because they either don't know what they're talking about or they're selling snake oil. But that does not mean that you have to just live with the risk and just hope you don't get hit. You can take steps like Scott was talking about, like what Ari was talking about, and you can manage and really reduce your risk and make yourself a much harder target.
Thank you for that. And I want to say again, thank you all for your time, your expertise today. This has, I think, been a really impactful discussion and not going to be the last, right? We want to continue to engage on this subject. It's something that's clearly bubbling up in federal policy and importance. So we're going to be continuing to engage on it. We're going to be looking at the questions that others asked and making sure we address those on future webinars. And we'll certainly be staying in touch. So again, thanks for our distinguished panelists. Thanks for those on the phone that are tuning in. And we will be continuing on this path down in the next couple months. So thanks again, everybody.